Thanks, Don. It's a pleasure to be back at LIVEXchange, and thank you to LiveCorp for the opportunity to come and talk to you today. I'll just get straight into it. I just want to acknowledge up front Sarah Wickham. I'll talk a little bit more about the team in a minute. In terms of content, a little bit of introduction, some context around the factors that led to this project being started. The project is not finished, so what you're getting is an update of preliminary results to date, which are primarily associated with a stakeholder survey that was done this year, and then finishing with a brief summary of what next, where we go to from here for the rest of this project. There's a lot of people in this team, and you may not be able to read all of this writing, but most of the work was done by Dr. Sarah Wickham, who's a postdoctoral fellow in animal welfare at Murdoch University. And there's a team of welfare experts at Murdoch behind Sarah as part of the Animal Health and Welfare Research Centre: Anne Barnes, Trish Fleming, David Miller, Teresa Collins. And then I'm part of the team more on the applied end of the spectrum. So together we cover right through from high technical levels of welfare scientific expertise through to the applied end. That's interesting. Getting all sorts of... In terms of context, you know, we've had animal welfare has been used, or the term has appeared in pretty much every talk that's occurred in LiveXchange yesterday and today. So it's a shared concern that involves everyone. There's no debate about that. And the welfare policy space is commonly described as a wicked policy problem. Wicked meaning that there's all sorts of dimensions around the policy space, and there's a lot of values and beliefs and differences of opinion, and there is no single simple solution to these kinds of areas. So it's been a problematic area to work in. And we've heard yesterday and today, Wayne Collier yesterday referred to the Australian standards for the export of livestock as the welfare standards. You know, more than 40 measures inside ACIL that nearly all can be mapped to some form of welfare outcome. And SCAS continues that attention to welfare across the remainder of the supply chain through to the point of slaughter in foreign countries. By any measure, the export industry is considered to be a heavily regulated industry, but there's still strong divergent views amongst the broader stakeholder group about where that should go. The Australian government is committed to reducing red tape, and there's been a lot of initiatives federally and within the various states and territories on trying to reduce the regulatory burden within various industries, not just the livestock industry. And we've got Peter talking next about the LGAP, the Quality Assurance Program, that is a part of that broader trend. And as part of that, we want to move towards better welfare indicators. And what do I mean by better? It'd be nice to measure welfare outcomes and not inputs. Many of the ACIL standards and SCAS standards are process or input related welfare standards, and they're not necessarily they're not always directly related to welfare outcomes measured on animals. So it would be nice to incorporate more animal measures where possible, and these are often more problematic to measure and report. It'd be nice to shift from negative welfare indicators. Animal welfare origins mostly are drawn from preventing animal cruelty 100-odd years ago or so, and many of the welfare indicators that are used historically are often about preventing negative welfare impacts. We need to be trending where we can towards reporting positive outcomes and demonstrating good performance. Welfare indicators need to cover the supply chain, of course, and then they need to have a variety of attributes. They need to be valid in that they should be measuring exactly what they intend to measure, should be representing the underlying welfare status of the animal. Robustness refers to things like reliability and repeatability. The same results should be obtained by different observers on different animals under different environments. They need to be practical and simple and feasible, and preferably relatively low cost. And I've purposefully got that at the bottom end because some of these other attributes are very important. And in particular, they need to be useful to stakeholders, not just to the export industry, but also to the broader stakeholder community, including the public and consumers of our product. Animal welfare policy is linked to social licence, and we've had talks at previous LiveXchanges, and there's another talk coming up on social licence. Charlie Arnott in the Centre for Food Integrity has produced some of these images and has a lot of nice information about social licence. You know, the little figure up on the top right-hand side of the image in front of you shows the continuum between a regulatory environment that is really rigid and bureaucratic and has lots of imposed constraints, and that's often the space that an industry might be in when it has lost or has reduced social licence. And at the other end of the spectrum, when an industry has very strong social licence, then there's a case to be made for more regulatory freedom, for more flexibility and more ability for the industry to self-regulate, if you like, or to be more responsive and flexible in how they manage measures to achieve good welfare outcomes. We probably lie on the right-hand side of this spectrum, but how far along or where we might sit on that continuum will depend really on your values and beliefs and where you might sit in the welfare spectrum. The Centre has done a lot of research about identifying drivers of social licence, and there's a mixture of drivers that are really important. The key driver is trust, and you can see that depicted here. Those are R-squared values. That's all statistical terminology. I won't go into that. There are drivers associated with science and with objectiveness and with training and competence. Those are less important than drivers that are associated with values and with confidence. And really, they're all influencing trust. So we need to be building trust if we're going to gain social licence. And this is not new to you. The same group, Centre for Food Integrity, has described these 7 elements of trust building, and they're all around sharing the right information to the right people at the right time. There needs to be full disclosure, it needs to be relevant to stakeholders, so it needs to be the type of information that stakeholders are interested in receiving. It should be clear and truthful, so objective data, objective science-based information, complete, sharing both positive and negative, and then accompanying that, we need to be demonstrating ethical behaviour, the right motivation. If we can achieve some or all of these kinds of attributes, then we're in the trust building space, and then we're gathering or building social licence, and on the back of that we should be able to work towards a more responsive or flexible regulatory framework. So that's where we sit. In terms of this project, I just want to move into to introduce the little bit of the methodology and talk about some of the results of a survey that was done. This is the first part of this Welfare Indicators project, a web-based survey widely advertised, particularly using social media to try and attract a pretty wide diversity of responses. Responses accepted over several months, a bunch of information that I'll go through in a minute about basic demographics for the respondents, and then their views and opinions on various issues around welfare and specific welfare indicators. 921 respondents completed the survey. There were additional respondents that did some or part but didn't complete all of it, and 74%, so 680 odd of those were members of the general public, and the remainder, 26%, were associated with the live export industry. And if you look there, you can see that the blow-up one on the right-hand side just shows a bit more breakdown on the 26% from the live export industry. The bulk of those are people directly involved in export-related activities, and particularly transport, so land transport, sea transport and air transport, followed by inspectors and research-related activities, followed by producers. So pretty broad cross-section, and then a very much smaller proportion of respondents that worked in other areas of the chain, either associated with exporter activities or associated with abattoirs. This chart just shows a breakdown by gender and age group. The age groups go from 18 up to older than 70, and the blue is males and the golden colour are females, and the top graph shows the public respondents and the bottom graph shows the live export industry respondents, and you can see that there are some interesting differences in there. In the public respondent group, nearly 80% of those are female. They cover the broad range of age groups. In the live export group, probably a little bit more dominance in the younger age groups, and 40% are female or 60% male, and so that might reflect the working breakdown of the live export industry. And these are just insights into understanding some of the different viewpoints of the two broad groups, the public respondents and the live export industry respondents. This chart just shows the level of education for the respondents, and again, this is interesting. The pink columns are drawn from Australian census data from the entire Australian population. And each of these little categories along the bottom relate to the highest level of education. So across the entire Australian population between 15 and 64, the pink columns demonstrate the highest level of education. About 28% of our population between 15 and 64 have not finished high school. About 17% have finished high school, about 16% have done some form of post-high school training, about 16% have done an undergraduate degree, and about 7 or 8% have done a postgraduate degree. And you can see that in the respondents to the survey, the public are in the blue columns and the live export respondents are in the yellow columns, that there's generally a higher level of education than the broad Australian population. Again, that's interesting. Interesting on a number of fronts, and maybe it explains that, maybe that reflects the interest of the individuals who are responding to the survey. Respondents were asked to provide information about their connection to the industry, and I'm sharing this information just for the public respondents. I mean, the live export industry people are obviously directly connected, and we've already talked about a summary of that. 90% of the public respondents were their association with the industry was solely just interest in animal welfare and advocates for animal welfare outcomes. Around 10% had an indirect connection with the industry, either a friend who works in the industry or some sort of connection through journalism or some other medium. Where do respondents get their information from about the industry? And this won't be surprising, I'm sure. The blue represents the public respondents and the golden columns are the live export industry. You can see that there are that each of these charts show some agreements and some differences. Most members of a much higher proportion of the public respondents get their information from the mainstream media and from the social media. A higher proportion of the live export industry respondents get their information from direct exposure, personal experience. Respondents were asked to indicate how they viewed the importance of animals across a variety of different categories, and there's some interesting things in here. These are the first, reading from left to right across here, these are animals as food, animals as clothing, animals as companions, animals for working, animals for athletic or competitive performance, and animals as a religious symbol. And so you can see that there's some interesting things in here. The live export industry respondents have a much higher likelihood of seeing animals as providing food, clothing, and for working purposes. Public respondents have a much higher likelihood of viewing animals as companions and much lower likelihood, and none of this is terribly surprising to you, but it does explain perhaps why some of the values and beliefs are a little bit different. Respondents were asked to indicate what welfare monitoring should be used for. A higher proportion of live export industry respondents see welfare monitoring as being useful for self-regulation of the industry, and as you would expect, a much lower proportion of public respondents see that as a reason for generating welfare indicators. Public respondents are much more interested in having welfare indicator information used by government as a regulatory mechanism for the industry. And there's some other dichotomies in here. The public respondents more likely to see welfare indicators as being used to apply penalties for poor welfare performance. But across the rest of these questions, there's pretty good agreement. Welfare indicators used as KPIs back to the public, reward for good welfare performance, identify welfare areas where welfare can be improved, and to identify research gaps and opportunities. Should welfare performance information be publicly released? More than 90% of public respondents want welfare performance measures being publicly available, and 60%, I think this is growing over time, 60% of live export industry respondents want welfare indicators being more publicly released. Who should collect welfare indicator information? Both groups agreed that welfare was a shared responsibility, that everyone across the supply chain has a responsibility and an involvement in both monitoring and collecting welfare information, and a responsibility for welfare outcomes. The public would prefer that welfare inspectors are independent of the export industry, and the export industry would prefer that that inspectors are working within the industry. There's a bit of a dichotomy of viewpoints there, that the export industry also did not want animal welfare groups in monitoring the welfare measures within the industry itself. I'm not going to go through these in detail, and I appreciate that you may not be able to read all of these. The group was asked to indicate the level of importance to them of around 30 different welfare factors, and some of these include slaughter practices, attitudes of stock persons, availability of water and feed, and so on. And on the left, on the bottom is a scale that ranges from your left of being not important over to the right-hand side of being highly important, and you can see the blue scale, the blue columns again, or bars, represent public respondents, and the golden bars represent live export industry respondents. And there's a lot of agreement in a bunch of welfare indicators up on the top that are considered to be the most important factors, both by public respondents and by industry respondents. And those are measures. The single most important measure was slaughter procedures. These are followed by measures around competence and training in stock persons and availability of water and feed and so on. And we'll go into these in a little bit more detail. The survey asked respondents to then talk about or assess particular candidate welfare indicators, ranking them in both by importance, whether they are either not important or important, and then on practicality. Are they practical to measure or are they impractical to measure? And the welfare indicators are grouped into what we call physiological indicators, animal behaviour, temperature, pregnancy status, and so on. Animal health indicators, so disease, parasites, morbidity, mortality, and environmental indicators, temperature, ventilation, humidity, and so on. And these are plotted, and I'm not going to go into these in detail either, because I can appreciate that you won't be able to read the detail, but the vertical axis shows an assessment of practicality, and so more practical measures are higher on the vertical axis. The horizontal axis is a measure of importance, so things that are more important are further to the right or further to your right on the horizontal axis. So the best measures are those that are most important and most practical in some senses, which are those clustered up in the top right-hand corner. And if I expand that, that's just a little expanded view of that top right-hand corner. So these are measures that are, and you can see that the blue diamonds show measures that are ranked by members of the public, and the gold squares show measures that are ranked by live export industry respondents. And there's a lot of agreement in here. We've got measures around disease and death and behaviour and physiological status, respiratory rate, that are both considered important by both groups and that are reasonably practical potentially to measure. There's some useful information in here, and conversely, I haven't gone into this, but there's a bunch of measures that are further down towards the bottom left-hand side that are either impractical to measure or that are considered not important. And so those are measures that are not going to be pursued very well as simple, reliable, practical, feasible welfare indicators. We've done the same thing for health indicators, and again, this is, I'm not going to go into each of these in detail, but the blown up little square in the centre there is an expanded view of the top right-hand corner. So those are some candidate measures that are considered by both members of the public and the live export industry to be both practical and important. And again, most of these are common sense, and many of these are already being collected in some form or another within the existing regulatory framework. A bunch of environmental indicators that are assessed in the same way, amount of shade, ventilation, air temperature, and again, many of these measures are either already present in the standards in some form or another, or information is already being collected through the existing regulatory framework. So in summary, there's a whole bunch of welfare-related indicators that are being collected under the existing regulatory framework. Many of those measures are related or can be mapped to welfare outcomes. There are relatively few animal-based measures, and there are relatively few measures that can be considered as direct assessment of welfare outcomes in animals, and they're mostly input and resource measures, and the current systems are not as transparent as they could be. So industry is being asked to comply with a regulatory burden and to produce a whole bunch of things like daily voyage reports, compliance with standards, health certifications, but very little of that gets shared with the public in any sort of transparent process. What we'd like to do in the rest of this project, we're just completing a review of the literature, looking at the scientific information to support various candidate welfare indicators around the world, and trying to identify or produce a summary of scientific knowledge about those measures that are both valid and robust, and map that to the survey information, and then map that to the existing standards and regulatory framework. We'd like to identify candidate measures that we think that there's likely to be a mixture of measures in this space, that some of those will be animal-based and so very directly related to welfare outcomes. Some of those will be resource-based, things like square metres of space, stocking density, provision of food and water, management-related factors, appropriate training and demonstration of competence, and so on. We want to come up with a small list of candidate indicators that meet all of these kinds of attributes, and particularly they have to be valid and robust, and we've talked about that already. They've got to be accurate indicators of welfare, they need to be reliable and repeatable, they've got to be practical, simple and feasible, and they have to reflect stakeholder interest. These measures provide candidates that we can then put forward with options for how they might be implemented, including a framework that allows them to be dashboarded and potentially released to the public as measures of good performance, and to identify areas where improvements might be made. This reflects, we think, a commitment on the behalf of industry to continuous improvement of animal welfare, and it's just another step in the chain to building social licence and making a case for a more responsive regulatory framework. And at the end of our report, we'll have options for implementations and costings and further R&D that might be required to develop some welfare indicators, or to demonstrate validity and robustness for some candidate welfare indicators. Thank you very much, Don.
Thanks, Nigel. There's nothing more interesting than trying to understand how not so much the audience but the public thinks, and we've yet to see more, so it'll be really interesting when it comes along. Any questions? Don't go, Nigel, just in case there's questions, please. How are we going? Yes, Steve Meerwald. Yeah. Coming down behind you, Steve.
To keep things in context, this is great in terms of understanding and getting community understanding of where the live export trade sits in the scheme of things. But has there been any thought or in context a project determined to benchmark what we're doing in this industry as opposed to what sort of the standard operating practice might be in terms of animal welfare indicators in the general farming community? Because I think the danger is that whatever we come up with will always be attacked for the very small percentage that you can't fix. And there's no real method of being able to portray that against what is the great unknown in what happens in general farming or general large animal production.
Thanks, Dave. It's a difficult question to answer. There's a whole variety of welfare indicator activities going on around the world, and there are various industries. New Zealand dairy industry, for example, has some nice dashboard information and some really simple welfare indicators that they're using to represent on-farm welfare, and the Australian dairy industry is doing the same thing. Lots of initiatives and developments in the intensive livestock industries. Pigs, for example, Australia is a world leader in that space. There are opportunities to compare. There are opportunities to compare the live export industry performance on some welfare measures against other land-based, on-farm-based welfare indicators and welfare indicators in the feedlot sector. But I think that's. I'm not sure if that's exactly where your question was coming from. I think those need to be undertaken with a little bit of care, because we don't necessarily want to try and justify anything on the basis that we're similar to or better than some other We don't want to divert attention away to some other sector of the industry. I think the industry should be proud of the good performance that it's doing and proud of the improvements that the industry is making. And so I think, in my mind, developing these welfare indicators that include some positive welfare indicators and that demonstrate these social licence attributes, things around trust and transparency and sharing information, those are about demonstrating really good performance wherever we can, and we need to be confident that we can do that, and then identifying problems and showing a commitment to addressing those when they occur, and they are going to occur because we're dealing in a biological system. So, that's the space where I think we need to be moving.